Please describe your experience with virtual clinical trials.
My experiences over the past 30 years is really centered more around, creating systems and solutions in the healthcare and life science space. Spent about 10 years of my experience in the life science and specifically in clinical trials, heading up all of their technology and really gaining a deep understanding around clinical trials.
What you as a CTO had to do to kind of enable a virtual clinical trials, and how does that change your day-to-day work?
The first thing I will say is that this transition that is going on from centralized or traditional clinical trials to decentralized, taking a software company or a software development team that happens to be all co-located into an office, and now taking them and now running that project virtually, right? Everybody's now in their home. Well, not too far from what it is today, interestingly enough. But that, I think just to give everybody, a relative context, that really is, you could appreciate the challenges and dynamics that come with such a change. For many people who are not familiar with this, think about, patient turns, if they're involved in a clinical trial, they're referred to as subjects. Doctors, if they're involved in a clinical trial, they're referred to as investigators. So, you have this very complex project that was more centralized around the investigator, who really did a lot of the coordination and activities associated with it. And the shift to virtual clinical trials is now you're decentralizing it, very much like breaking people out of an office and sending them off, because now, the patient who through the investigator is recruited, is qualified, is randomized, the drug is administered, treatment and monitoring has to occur, throughout the clinical trial, all centered around the investigator in the doctor's office. And now taken and essentially saying, we're going to, a complete virtual clinical trial, you're going to remove all of that, right? And now deal with the fact that the patient's going to stay, for the most part, at home. And all those things, everything from recruitment all the way through to drug treatment and monitoring, is now all done virtually. And, that definitely ends up, adding a significant level of complexity across, running that clinical trial and dealing with all the logistics associated with it. And frankly, that's what the industry is going through. Up to the start of this pandemic, I think everybody knows that and have seen, trying to figure it out, right? How do you do it, right? And probably about a year ago, I've seen the greatest amount of energy in trying to make that shift. This pandemic has clearly caused a great sense of urgency and criticality to make that change very, very quickly, which is, again, no easy feat. And, requires, a shift in technology, ability to now connect up to the patient while they're at home, monitor the patient remotely through those technologies, capture data, and bring that data back into the systems, and becomes a change for the way people work. CRAs are now not visiting investigators to actually do source document verification. Even the qualification becomes more challenging in this process, and companies, frankly, as I see it, are still working to figure it out. It's a real challenge, and I see a lot of good progress being made, but a lot more to be done.
Where do you see the most applicability in virtual clinical trials?
Clearly, phase 1 is not applicable given the fact that it's happening within a clinic. So, that doesn't apply. But phase 2 and phase 3 clearly are the case. But then the other thing, too, that I think for everybody to understand, that we're sitting here talking about virtual clinical trials, for which at the moment, extreme virtuality is needed as much as possible given our situation around the world. However, the reality of it is we're really talking about what ultimately will end up being hybrid clinical trials. Still patient-centric, but it isn't to the point where the patient will only be participating as a subject from home, right? They will continue to go meet with a doctor or an investigator. But really the goal is to make the experience for the patient easier, simpler, more effective, and at the same time, reduce the number of visits, to meet with a doctor or investigator as much as possible, using technology and different methodologies and practices to accomplish that.
What do you see in terms of the skill set and what needs to be proven by a vendor to be able to be helpful to either a sponsor or a CRO?
From a clinical trial perspective, where we are today, there's too much technology, right? It's riddled with so many disparate systems that are out there. What's going to happen, and where I think companies like Avanga and others could help in terms of the companies that come to you guys, is really centered around expertise in being able to more easily and simply integrate these existing technologies, especially as it applies to the shift towards the needs of virtual or patient-centric clinical trials or even hybrid trials, so that and number two, help the industry avoid propagating more technologies, derivative technologies. Let's not create a new breed of EDC systems. Let's not create a new breed of CTMS systems. Let's find a way to actually tie all of these things together, and again, enable the shift in how clinical trials are run. With all of this fuels more data, right? I mean, you're essentially, if you use your e-consent form, right? Before it was a piece of paper, somebody signed it in the doctor's office. Well, that's just one example of many. We're going to propagate more data swimming around each one of these clinical trials, which is an opportunity to really actually improve the way clinical trials are run, if that data is analyzed and leveraged, and then the use of intelligence is derived from it. So the whole world of data science, as it applies to understanding clinical trials, I think is another area where companies can actually contribute to, frankly, even taking traditional trials and moving them forward.
Have you developed checklist in terms of the technology that is a must in virtual clinical trials?
Is there a checklist of new things? Not necessarily, but there is how do you change the ones we already have and are in use to accommodate the different way in which clinical trials are going to be run in a more decentralized way. I'm actually going to touch on the ones I think are opportunistic. There's another level of complexity that needs to get some focus, and that really is around the logistics of running a decentralized clinical trial. Trials are complicated, a lot of moving parts, a lot of people involved. And now I've just put these people in, I put them in their homes and said, I still want you to be a patient subject. And we're going to do all the same things somehow. Well, how do you get drugs to that person? Well, wait a minute, that drug actually have to be kept cold. Another example is, you often will have nurses, right, who are going to visit these people and be, dispatched out there. Very common for, companies who have attempted to go into the virtual clinical trial space. They do that, but what ends up happening is the logistics of coordinating the nurse to go there, both in the availability of the patient. They arrive, the patient's not home, or the challenge associated with them arriving. Oh, wait, the patient has a dog. I'm allergic to dogs. I can't go in. Some of these things have to be done in a time-constrained way. And so now you've got these logistics of making sure it happens within the time limitations that it is required to in accordance with the protocol and the regulations. And yet you have a higher miss rate, if you will, than you would otherwise have. Now, are there solutions out there that are dealing with this? I get back to integration of existing systems, but the intelligence of coordinating all that stuff and communicating out to participants, that is an opportunistic area for which, I think is going to be really important. If you really want to talk about a patient-centric, meaning I want to make the experience for the patient much better, but still I want the outcome of the clinical trial to be effective, there's a lot of potential opportunity for which, technology, pre-thought out technology could actually have a significant impact and lessen the pain point and frankly the costs, because you can do this with people, right? Making phone calls. Okay, wait, they're going to have to go there. Let me call. You're going to be home. You could do this with people, which is very common because many CROs, it's a very people intensive business. But the reality of it is there's a huge opportunity to leverage the use of technology to augment the people and let them focus on the trial itself and actually seeing what's going on.
What do you think people should be learning as they are kind of want to attach their career to the clinical research organization?
There's kind of three core things. And number one is to have enough of an understanding of the science behind clinical trials. The biology element of it becomes key. Just simply knowing how to read a protocol, no matter where you are in a clinical trial, is important. And many people, as you know, have never even looked at a protocol, yet they're involved in a clinical trial. And it's governing document for how trials are run. So, understanding the biology associated with it is key. Understanding the basics of technology, how is it used, how does it work, how does it affect running a clinical trial, becomes important. The last one, from a hard skills perspective, is really centered around the data science world. And again, I'm not talking about being a data scientist, but actually at least understanding the power that could be derived from data and how it would fit in to the first two. Number one, there are the regulations, and yes, whether it's about data privacy as applicable to it, or what you have to do to comply with e-consent, or qualifications of a patient to be a subject on a clinical trial. Clearly, all of those things have to be loosened up a little bit with a very reasonable sense of what is real risk and what is the risk of actually not embracing using that Fitbit, right, versus having to develop a brand new Fitbit specifically for use in clinical trials. But then the other piece of it is really the interpretation of regulations, as we all know, and how companies go about interpreting that. It could be interpreting it in an extreme sense, or it could be interpreted in an appropriate way whereby, there is more freedom there than maybe we realize, but that means companies have to take a little bit more risk in order for them to embrace that change. And I think, those two factors are really driving it. Clinical trials are regulated. Not only, the sites are regulated, the devices, the software is regulated, the process is regulated, the training is regulated. I see all of them being incredibly influential in the FDA these days in helping them make the change, realize the change, in terms of what those regulations are for clinical trials to be run differently. And, I think in the end, that's a good thing, and we need more of it. If you move into that technology space around things like wearables, we could imagine that in the future that will actually be the case. Again, I get back to a patient, they're sitting in their house and they need to understand, how do I take my blood pressure? The role of augmented reality, virtual reality to help guide through the use of intelligence and the intersection of clinical science and data science, more of that happening. And we see the companies doing it, right? The acquisitions that go on, companies buying one another, the mergers of, Quintiles and IMS as an example, and others. I think the industry sees it. But then what's next? All right, so now you have all that. And yes, we have some good, data science being applied to better interpret all this data. But I also think that, using more artificial intelligence to help improve the complex process of clinical trials. Some of the logistics I talked about earlier, right? Finding inaccurate data actually as it's being captured, right? And then actually taking immediate action. It's just all over the place. There's huge opportunities for that. And I think that's where it's going to go in the short term before we start to do cutting people opening and putting sensors inside of them.